giving the results of their state convention yesterday. They were sorry they could not attend this, but state law requires that they have their convention yesterday. But the fax contains the information that they vote unanimously for Ralph Nader.
And here comes the tally of votes.
Okay, well, thanks to the miracle of modern computers, we have the totals now. They are 295 votes in favor of Ralph Nader and Winona LaDuke, 10 votes in favor of Stephen Gaskin and Winona LaDuke, 10 votes in favor of Jello Biafra and Mumia Abu Jamal, and 1 vote for none of the above. Clearly, after the first round of voting, we have a majority in favor of Ralph Nader and Winona LaDuke. And we'd like to ask now to see the unanimous consent of this body that we are supporting Ralph Nader and Winona LaDuke to be the next President of the United States.
One last time, I want to bring Jello Biafra and Stephen Gaskin up for your enthusiastic appreciation. They have both pledged to work enthusiastically for the ticket, with or without the promise of a federal judgeship. And now I'd like to introduce the man who will bring Ralph Nader to the podium. Ronnie Duggar. Ronnie Duggar is a reporter, a biographer of Lyndon Johnson and Ronald Reagan, a founder and editor of the Texas Observer, as well as the Alliance for Democracy. And, not to be outdone by anyone in this room, Ronnie Duggar is seeking the Green Party of New York State nomination for the United States Senate.
Mr. Nader is a singularity. He is Mr. Emerson's great person, the one who in the midst of the crowd keeps with perfect sweetness the independence of solitude. He is an astonishment of informedness, fresh opinions, high good humor, and always his service to his relentless, lifelong resolve to do the good thing for democracy and the people. He's a great reader, and he gives friends books like some people give advice. He is always an inspiration. He said to a young woman who was joining one of his projects, "Give all you've got down to the marrow of your bones." That's what he gives all the time. Many of us scattered over the country, and I imagine most of us in this room, aspire to be like him. To be the person who knows of himself, as Mr. Emerson also knew of himself, that what I must do is all that concerns me, not what people think. Unquestionably, Mr. Nader is a patriot and a civic hero. He embodies the highest office in a democracy, the office of citizen. By common consent, he is public citizen number one. Now he is running all out with pumping heart, full tilt for the presidency. He's on the ballot in 30 states, 31 as of today, and going to 48. He's raised $1 million and going for 10, counting the matching funds. He's already campaigned in 4 months in all 50 states. He has plunged altogether into the passion and action of these times, and we are honored to be able to be witness and participant in this great adventure. This all began when a young Princeton and Harvard Law graduate was working on the unsafety of cars, and General Motors hired spies to follow him. What GM learned was don't mess with Ralph Nader. The public rage against GM gave Nader a great moral and political power that he has used wisely, carefully, and well, and that has led us to this day. He has written books, testified before Congress, fostered the practice of public interest law, and inspired and shepherded citizen activists. He has been a one-man social movement, a single-point source of some of the best things that have happened in our country for the past 35 years. Like an oak tree dropping an acorn, he founded Public Citizen. He founded the Center for Auto Safety. He founded the Disability Rights Center, the Pension Rights Center, Congress Watch, Public Campaign, the Student Public Interest Research Groups in more than 20 states, and state and local models for lawyers to fight City Hall and those damn developers. Yet, also, he alone, Mr. Nader, he himself, formed citizens groups to fight for safe air travel, for clean water, for healthy food, for an open government. He encouraged the formation of consumer co-ops like Buyers Up to keep the price of home heating oil low in the Northeast. He and his Naders Raiders are responsible, as Jim Hightower was saying, for the Safe Water Act, the Safe Air Act, the Freedom of Information Act, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, the Occupational Safety and Health Agency, and the Environmental Protection Agency. Corporate abuse worldwide is documented in his excellent multinational monitor. And when corporate power and abuse went global, so did he. Nader groups like Global Trade Watch and Public Citizen led the fight in Seattle against the WTO, which was the fight for safe workplaces, safe food, a clean environment, and a living wage for the people in countries all over the world beyond this one. Now, since GM sent its spies to watch Mr. Nader, the safety measures that the government has ordered the automakers to build in have saved, out of the deaths in car crashes that would have occurred on the projections otherwise, about 1 million of our lives. Not to mention our limbs. God, we're in his debt. He and his teams have improved the quality of the food we eat, the water we drink, the air we breathe. Our airplanes, our jobs, our children are safer because of him. The information about the government and the big corporations that is in our minds is truer because of him. Now, we can repay a smidgen of the debt today when he speaks by not flashing cameras at him. He asks that that not happen, and that he will stay at the podium after he has finished speaking for that purpose as freely as you want. Mr. Nader has disclosed to the press that he has $4 million. Power to him. He lives on $25,000 a year and doesn't even have a car. With $500,000 of his dollars, he funded studies of the voting records of members of Congress, which certainly weren't worth $500,000. He gives 80% of his money to civic projects, which, as someone said on the internet, is 70% more than that which is required by the Bible. What has been Mr. Nader's underlying motive in all this passionate work? Gandhi said that we must be brave enough to love one another. Nader told us yesterday afternoon, here at the Green Party convention, at the reception, that when he was little, his mother, who is here with him, asked him, "Are you a patriot?" "Yes," he said. "Do you love your country?" "Yes," he said. "Well," she said, "I hope you make it more lovable." That is the essence of patriotism, making your country more lovable. By backing Mr. Nader, we are joining him in exercising the power of love for our country. Mr. Nader is running for president for love of his country, and we support him for president because we love our country, and we love justice, and we love the home, which is the earth where we all live. And the time has come for the citizens of the United States to rebel politically. We support Mr. Nader because we refuse to stay in the two-party trap forever, because only he is broaching and discussing the issues of the converging human crisis that we as a people must discuss and decide. Because for good citizens, casting your vote shouldn't make you sick. Because when we vote, for Ralph Nader, we will be very proud of that vote. We support him also, and so should we all, simply because he is the best person running. We know that from his 40 years of public service that he is not for sale. Unlike some candidates we might name but will not, he will not sell out. Unlike, he has the integrity of Thoreau, he has the compassion of St. Francis, and he, better than those really, knows how the government works. With artificial power, he has already achieved more governmental reform than we have had since the 1930s. We haven't had a man, in my opinion, like Ralph Nader, run for president since Thomas Jefferson and Abraham Lincoln combined. Mr. Nader was so relaxed, informal, and happy at the reception yesterday that John Anderson said to him, "Ralph, you've loosened up quite a bit." I believe that's because he has decided that he can win. Yesterday he told the press, "I want to win." Today he was asked by an important journalist if he thought he could win. He replied, "Yes." Today we say together, we will win. Ralph Nader is going to get in those debates, and he is going to win because he should get in those debates, and he should win, and because we the people are still we the people. The TV stations don't own our elections. Anheuser-Busch, the Democratic Party, and the Republican Party do not own our elections. The big corporations don't. The Indonesians don't. The billionaires don't. The Chinese don't. The people of the United States own our elections. And we are going we are going to give the country and the world the shock of this period by electing Ralph Nader President of the United States. With 118 candidates running across the country for everything from town council to the U.S. Senate, and with Mr. Nader leading us, this will be the year of the Greens. But we do not crusade for ourselves alone. We crusade for our country, but not for our country alone either. The human race and all of the earth are jeopardized by oil and coal and smog and ozone holes, and we all know it. We crusade for 6 billion people and all our posterity down to the 70th generation. For when Mr. Nader leads America, America will worthily lead the world. And so, for after a brief 5-minute video, which will follow what I have to say, with pride and honor, I present to this Green Party convention of the Association of State Green Parties, and we present to the people of the United States our nominee for President of the United States, Ralph Nader.
Never get discouraged. Never get discouraged.
What do you suppose I called to give us this good advice? Ralph Nader!
Blood on the car. Blood on the car.
When you sit down behind the wheel of a car and look around you, what do you see that you don't like?
Well, fundamentally, I see a room full of knives and sharp edges.
Well, I think a lot of the critics don't know what they're talking about.
I always look on lawyers as people who simply represent justice and defending the disadvantaged and the powerless.
We call 250,000 square feet of artificial turf because they said there's too much lead in the green paint. Ah, yeah, damn Ralph Nader.
No difference between your and yours except the rhetoric. The same politicians who gave us massive deficits, scandals, and SNL bailouts turned around and gave themselves a $35,000 a year salary increase. Please call me Ralph. We're up here. Anything you want. Do you enjoy eating rats? New York, it's Sunday night! Human rights groups, student groups, consumer groups, environmental groups, all on the same side. It's because everything they believe in is being removed further and further to the Geneva headquarters of the WTO. here I turn down the poppies, poppies are gonna turn down you. Well, you'll be more likely to run a poll, particularly at a younger age, if you know what the issues are and if you can push for real choices between different candidates. Democracy means a word, self-government. Well, if you want to live in a free country, you also have to be an active citizen. You've got to try to improve the country. These corporations are meddling with the most priceless genetic inheritance of humanity for short-term profit, for negligence, for myopia, for stupidity, for greed, for cowardice. Must be stopped. One can tell within the government is an aroused, informed, and dynamic public.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Ralph Nader.
Thank you very much. None of this would have been possible without people in this room and all over the country. The stimulation to the campaign by various candidates in the primary season here. And I want to really express my appreciation for a lot of unsung categories of citizen action. Organizers, canvassers, petitioners, our great staff in Washington, and the one that's building up around the country, who are working enormous hours with incredible dedication. So much so that I have to tell them to go home at the end of the day. On behalf of all Americans who seek a new direction, who yearn for a new birth of freedom to build the just society, who see justice as the great work of human beings on earth, who understand that community and human fulfillment are mutually self-enforcing, who respect the urgent necessity to wage peace, to protect the environment, to end poverty, and to preserve values of the spirit for future generations, who wish to build a deep democracy by working hard for a regenerative, progressive politics. To all these citizens and the Green Vanguard, I welcome and am honored to accept your nomination for President of the United States.
party stands for a nation and a world that consciously advances the practice of this deep democracy. A deep democracy that facilitates people's best efforts to achieve social justice, a sustainable and bountiful environment, and an end to systematic bigotry and discrimination against people just because they're different. Green goals place community and self-reliance over dependency on ever larger and more absentee giant corporations with their technology and capital and influence over so many governments and government policies. Green goals aim at preserving the commonwealth of assets that the people of the United States already own, so that people, not big business, control what they own and use these vast resources on the public lands and the public airways and trillions of worker pension dollars to achieve healthier environments, healthier communities, healthier people, and to establish a trusteeship for these resources on behalf of future generations. These goals are not just green goals. If we get down to the level of everyday life, they are also goals held by many authentic conservatives, not corporatists, authentic conservatives. Don't conservatives, in contrast to corporatists, want movement toward a safe environment where their children can breathe clean air and drink clean water? Don't they want to end corporate welfare, the diversion of their tax dollars to undeserving large corporations? Don't they want to oppose and do something about the commercialization of childhood? Don't conservatives also want a voice to achieve a fair marketplace, one that responds to their own health needs and the integrity of their own savings? Let us not in this campaign prejudge any voters, for green values are majoritarian values. They're more than that. Green values respect all peoples and all strivings. They give greater rights to all voters, workers, individual taxpayers, and consumers. And as with the right of free speech, and this is central, we may not agree with others, but we will defend their right to free speech as strongly as we do for ourselves. That ultimate green value is the value of universality, respecting all people's rights to participate in power, to shape their own communities, countries, world. Earlier this year, I decided to seek your nomination because the obstacles blocking ready-made solutions, and this country has far more problems than it deserves and far more solutions than it applies. The obstacles to our society's injustices just have to be overcome. Feelings of powerlessness and the withdrawal of massive numbers of Americans from both civic and political arenas are deeply troubling to all of us. This situation has to be addressed by a fresh political movement, one that arises from the citizens' labors, resources, and dreams in that order. Dreams about what America could become at long last. The worsening concentration of global corporate power and its enormous manifestations in concentrating political power to serve them has turned that government there, our government here, very frequently against their own peoples, denying these peoples their sovereignty to shape their own future, Again and again, the will of the people has been thwarted, and the will and the voice of the people to protect their interests and to protest has been muted. In the past, citizens who had participated in this country's social justice movements faced steep concentration of power and overcame them. It's always good to dwell a little bit on the past because it gives us motivation. The sources of civic motivation come very often from the heroics of our forebears. Common themes occur from the revolution of 1776 against King George III's empire, to the anti-slavery drives and the women's suffrage movements of the 19th century, to the farmers' revolt against the big banks and the big insurance companies and big railroads that began in the late 19th century, to the trade union, civil rights, environmental, and consumer protection initiatives of the 20th century, culminating in the demands for equity by Americans who are discriminated against due to their race, gender, creed, tribal status, class, disability, or sexual preference. What do all these have in common? All these movements took on excessive power, pressed for relinquishment or sharing of this power, despite vigorous opposition by elements of the dominant business community. Many years were lost to the resolution of these injustices before justice began to prevail and corporate power receded. However, when citizens won and Tory merchants in the Revolutionary War lost, when citizens won and cotton slaveholders lost, and corporations were compelled to share that power with the people they oppressed or excluded, America was a better place as a result. America became more beautiful. Moreover, the companies behaved better, and in the irony of our political economy, actually prospered more. And this is really the theme that we need to emphasize as we go out around the country in this next few months. That the shift of power is extremely critical to a democratic society, and Louis Brandeis said it best. In 1941, Justice of the Supreme Court, he said, quote, "We can have a democratic society, or we can have the concentration of great wealth in the hands of the few. We cannot have both," unquote. Over the past 20 years, starting around 1979, we have seen the resurgence of big business power after having to give up a little in the 1960s and 70s to the various populist movements such as consumer, environmental, human rights, civil rights. This power has generated its own brand of wreckage, propaganda, and ultimatums on American labor, consumers, taxpayers, and most generically, American voters. Big business has been colliding with American democracy, and American democracy has been losing on all too many fronts. The results of this democracy gap are everywhere to be observed by those who suffer these results and by those who employ people's yardsticks to measure the quality of the economy, not corporate yardsticks. People yardsticks. It's quite interesting. Looking back on the last 20 years, corporations have been very demanding of our government, and they've got almost all their demands. They demanded lesser law enforcement, which they called deregulation, and they got it. They demanded more tax shelters, and they got it. They demanded forgiveness of the debts that they owed Uncle Sam, and they got it. They demanded that Uncle Sam subsidize and bail them out and transfer all kinds of medical knowledge and natural resources free to these companies, and they got it. They demanded an expansion of the receptivity by political officials to political action committee money, cash, campaigns. And they got it. We've gone from 400 political action committees in 1974 to 9,000 today. They demanded that the governments in office not be pro-labor. If anything, turn their back on labor. They got it. Being pro-labor is almost a taboo phrase in Washington, D.C. Now, what did we get in return for that? They got almost everything they wanted. And here's what we got in return. An even greater furtherance of their greed and their desire to impose more controls and more corporate regulation over the people of this country. Yes, corporate regulation. Over the next 4.5 months, this campaign must challenge the campaigns. This campaign must challenge the campaigns of the Bush and Gore duopoly in every locality, running with the people, not as Bush and Gore do, not as Bush and Gore do, parading around the country looking for photo opportunities and staged events. When Americans go to work, they may wonder about these injustices, and it's time to put them on the table because they're part of everyday life. Everyday life. Tomorrow morning, millions of Americans will go to work. Many of them will wonder who's going to take care of their elderly parents. Who's going to take care of their children? How can they afford it? They'll go to work irritated by the endless traffic jams coming from a horribly imbalanced transportation system. And they'll arrive at work knowing for the most part that they can be fired at the end of the day, that their rights are stifled in the workplace, their personal privacies can be invaded. They go back into the market to shop for the evening's meal, and they see how in many ways they can be ripped off. They can be ripped off by unscrupulous sellers and large companies and pharmaceutical firms. They try to address their own grievance and they call the telephone number of the bank or HMO or their government agency in City Hall, and they get put on hold, don't they? And they are told, press 1, press 2, press 3. And you know how much of life is just spent listening to those recorded announcements and how they treasure your patronage, but the employees are serving others like you, and then often they put music on, and billions of hours are wasted that could be used for other things. All this in a modern telecommunications society, I might add. And then you don't get an answer to your question very often. You get people who specialize in telling you no in all kinds of polite, sweet ways. There are times at night when I'm working late and I want to listen to classical music. I dial United Airlines. Can't we even get our local, state, and national governments and our corporations to answer our phone with a human being? Now, continue on the daily life of millions of Americans. They're beset by worries about how to pay for health care, and they can't afford it. And then when they do get the health care, they have to spend hours figuring out the bills, which are often in code, and they're overlapping from different services. And then they wonder about how little time they have in their frenzied life for children, family, friends, community, civic activities. And they're overcome often by the sheer ugliness of commercial strips and sprawls and incessantly saturating advertisements. I confess that I think if some of these companies could develop the technology, they'd plant those logos right on your eyeballs. People daily are repelled by the voyeurism of the mass media. That doesn't even need explanation. The commercialization of childhood. They're upset at the rejection of the wisdom of our elders and our forebears, as if it's old-fashioned, it's not up to date, it's not modern. They're anxious over the ways their tax dollars are being misused. They're feeling that there needs to be more to life than a desperate rat race to make ends meet and a never-ending process of going deeper and deeper into consumer debt. Well, for all people who do experience these things, do think about becoming a part of a progressive movement of Greens, of this citizen campaign to change the political economy so that healthy environments, healthy communities, and healthy people become its overwhelming reason for being. Now look at Europe and what it has accomplished since 1946. Some of the Western European governments have provided all their citizens with health care coverage, comprehensive daycare, other services for children that we can only dream about, labor laws which facilitate the organization of trade unions, a statutory social wage for all workers, whether they're unionized or not, which provide 1 month paid vacation, retention of pay while caring for sick family members, adequate pensions, other services. Why can't we? If they can do it, if they can. If Scandinavia and France and Germany and the Benelux countries and others, if they can do it in the 1950s and 1960s, why can't the richest country in the world do it in the year 2000? In the year 2000, most workers in our country don't have these basic rights. In fact, just last week, the World Health Organization ranked our healthcare system as 37th in the world in terms of the quality of health care. And part of that was because there are about 47 million people in this country who don't have health care insurance to begin with. This is not only embarrassing, it's unacceptable. Western European countries now are full of their own corporations who are being tutored by our corporations on how to rip apart the safety net. And I ask the many Greens in this audience from the European countries who have graced us with our presence to fight that inundation of coarseness with every ounce of strength that they have. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we need to collectively understand these inequities so that many of our citizens can translate this understanding into a demand for solutions. The problem is that so many of these inequities have become normalized. They become institutionalized. That's just the way it is. That's the way the ball bounces. Que sera, sera. And that's what we have to overcome. Because if people's expectation levels are pressed downward, they will accept more and more injustices because of their very powerlessness and their very feeling that they can't make a difference, that together they can't become part of the sovereignty of the people to shape the future of their lives and the future of our country. A collective understanding must distinguish between the people's yardsticks of where we're at in this country about the quality of our economy, not corporate yardsticks. Now consider business money in politics, which overpowers labor money by $11 to $1. Corruption reaches new peaks every 2 years and further nullifies our own vote, what the voting franchise should be all about. What about the bragging that we hear from Washington and Wall Street about the economy's nearly 10 straight years of great performance? Well, let's look at how it affects regular people in this country by applying people's yardsticks. A very different picture emerges, does it not? A very different picture. Because the benefits of this boom have accrued to the wealthier families, to the top 3 to 1% in inordinate proportion. And here are the people's yardsticks. And we should look at these conditions as a motivation for change, not as a depressing spectacle of what we have all allowed to happen. All right, people always say, you know, all these depressing facts, they discourage us. Well, let me tell you something. I can't understand that attitude. To me, when I hear about or study or document injustice, it just motivates me. But that's maybe because I'm not into mood changes, and I hope you aren't either. We have over 20% child poverty in the United States. It's 25% California, and nationwide it's 25% of preschool youngsters. There are some countries in Western Europe that have essentially abolished child labor, and they did it in the 50s and 60s. What's our excuse? This is by far, perhaps, the most leading indicator about the quality of our economy. I've never heard Chairman Alan Greenspan, in all the testimony before Congress, say, members of the distinguished Joint Economic Committee, I am here to tell you that the state of our economy is not sound because, first and foremost, almost 1 out of every 5 youngsters lives in deep, brutal, denying, and dangerous poverty. When will he ever say something like that? There are 130 million workers who work for pay in this country. There are a lot of other workers who don't work for pay. At home, for example. 130, about 90 million of them are full-time and 40 million part-time. And we're told we have a low unemployment rate. It's about 4%. Well, do you know that the Department of Labor measures unemployment this way? If you're working 21 hours a week and you want to work full-time but can't find a full-time job, you're considered employed. And really, how employed are you at $5.25 an hour, or $6, or $7, or $8, or $9 an hour? There are 10 million workers in this country, 3/4 of them adults, who are making minimum wage. And 47 million out of the 130 million workers in this country are making less than $10 an hour. That's not a livable wage, especially since that's the gross wage. You got to deduct from that the car you have to use to get to work, and the auto insurance, and the repair, etc. That often is not focused enough on. The cost of getting to work is a net deduction from the measly wages that people get. And how about this? The majority of the workers still, after 10 years of overall economic growth, make less today in inflation-adjusted dollars and work longer hours, 160 hours on the average a year, than they did in 1973. Now you see the other candidates, especially Al Gore, he's always saying, what a great rosy economy this is. Whose yardsticks is he using? He's using the yardsticks of his corporate paymasters. That's his yardsticks he's using. On top of it, it's $6.2 trillion in consumer indebtedness. Yeah, there are more jobs than ever before. You hear Al Gore say there are 22 million more jobs created since 1993. Reminds me of the old cartoon, you know, where a reporter had a microphone in the face of a couple workers, and he asked one worker, you know, the economy It grew by 6 million jobs this year. And the worker replied, yeah, I know, I've got 3 of them. The point is that you can have 2 members of the family working. They can hardly make ends meet, and they go deeper and deeper into debt. And that's something we should pay attention to. Let's not idealize the past, but in 1950, in a textile mill town in Connecticut, where the workers weren't paid all that much, a worker could pay for a 6-room house on a 3% 30-year mortgage. 3, now it's 8.25%, and buy a second-hand car. Today, 2, 3 workers would have a hard time having a standard of living called middle-class standard of living, and because of the lack of livable wages. The lower unemployment rate also is masked by low wages and millions of part-time laborers who are registered as employed, but they're really grossly underemployed. So we should never allow ourselves to be controlled by the tyranny of those yardsticks. It's a controlling process. Watch out for those official statistics, because they often serve the interests of concentrated power, which we can call the oligarchy or the plutocracy. Who designed this economy that had such massive accumulative wealth and such poor distributive economic justice? Was it Topsy, or was it economic forces beyond the control of regular people? An economy that grows with more ways to leave people behind raises the question of what will happen when we experience a recession, or worse. Then, of course, there's the people's yardsticks for individuals who pay most of the taxes to their governments. And of course, this has always been a scandal. My favorite example, 1981, 1983, General Electric made $6.3 billion in profits, paid not a cent of corporate income tax to Uncle Sam, and got a $120 million refund because of the safe harbor loophole that was on the books at that time. It's been repealed. But here's the comparison. One worker in a General Electric office or a General Electric factory in those years paid more in total dollars to Uncle Sam than General Electric, one of the biggest tax escapees still at large. The concentration of wealth and its political power has reached stunning intensities, and it can be measured in certain everyday ways. In the top 500 largest companies in this country, in 1940, the CEOs of those companies, and not known for their self-restraint in terms of their pay, paid themselves 12 times the average entry wage of their workers. 12 times. In 1980, it rose to 40 times. And today, it's 416 times the entry-level work. Today, the financial wealth of the top 1% of households exceeds the combined wealth of the bottom 95% of American households. And earlier this year, Bill Gates' wealth was equal to the combined wealth of the poorest 120 million Americans, almost 40-some% of the entire population. Now, you may think that this is a commentary on Bill Gates, the great software imitator from Redmond, Washington. And recently judged illegal monopolists. If we can personify his company in his own personage, you know what it really tells me? It tells me that tens of millions of workers in this country work every year, some of them decade after decade, are essentially broke with no net worth. Essentially broke. Globally, it gets worse. The combined annual income of the world's 200 richest people is equivalent to the combined annual income of the world's poorest 3.5 billion people on this planet. And the 200 richest people have had good times recently. They have more than doubled their net worth between 1996 and 1999. Now the net worth, this would be, of course, thank you. What about the further privileges of these larger companies would be diminished if we netted out all the subsidies and handouts and bailouts. That would be substantially diminished. Already, their taxes, in terms of corporate income tax, contribute to less than 10% of the federal budget, even though they're producing overall massive record profits. But you know, there's a difference between big business and small business, isn't there? Here's one. When big business gets into trouble due to speculation, corruption, or mismanagement, it doesn't go bankrupt. It goes to Washington for a bailout. It's only small business that is given the wondrous freedom of going bankrupt with nobody in Washington worrying about it. You know the New York Stock Exchange? They want a new building, the bastion of global capitalism. They wanted a new building. They told the mayor of New York, you either give us a building and land, or we might move across the Hudson River to New Jersey. So of course, New York City said, okay, we'll cobble together $500 to $1 billion of tax money, get the land, and build the building for you. Can you imagine? Can you imagine 50,000 small businesses in Manhattan petitioning all together to the mayor saying, you know, if you don't give us billions of dollars and new buildings and new shops, we're going to move to New Jersey. Yeah, like fun. What about the measures of environmental devastation? These don't appear, you know, on the balance sheets of Exxon, DuPont, General Motors, Peabody, Coal, degrading the air, water, and soil, so it becomes an active harm to human health. Degrading these biospheres don't register on the annual reports of these companies, of course not. Global warming, ozone depletion, oceanic deterioration, forest clear cutting do not have company logos on them. GM still has not been held responsible for the PCB poisoning of the Hudson River and got away with a trivial charge for what it did to my home area's Housatonic River. A low-level flight across the USA, you take a flight across the USA, low level, you would reveal the enormous wounds and scars, the toxic hotspots, the runoffs and the dumps exacted by the timber, mining, paper, chemical, and metal industries, taking out the livability of entire communities and their legion of worker victims. More coal miners have lost their lives from black lung disease and mine collapses in the past 110 years than all the American lives lost in World War II. And that's just one industry to indicate the ultimate sacrifices that blue-collar workers have made in factories, mines, and foundries. And I might add, the migrant workers and other farm workers who work the fields and harvest our food. This is interesting how certain tragedies don't come to the attention because they're everyday, they're quiet, they're silent. The 65,000 Americans who die every year from preventable air pollution, the 100,000 Americans who die every year from exposure to toxics and trauma in their workplace, 80,000 Americans who die from incompetence and negligence in hospitals. You know, you don't see those on Geraldo very often. You don't see those on the late evening news. You don't hear much about the asthmatic children with asthma screamingly high, 41% in the inner city among minority kids in Hartford, 41% asthma. You don't hear much about the deadly effects of lead poisoning, with the lead companies knowing through their own scientists since the beginning of the 20th century that it's not safe to put lead in gasoline, it's not safe to put lead in paint, and the resulting damage to millions of little children's brains and bodies, as well as adults, until we're getting this lead out of the environment. These are the silent epidemics that are often ignored by even people who should know better, people who teach our students in our college courses and high school courses. The mortality and morbidity toll is far in excess of the appalling street-level homicides, which amounted to about 20,000 homicides last year. The corporate youth addictors, the drug dealers par supreme, the tobacco and alcohol industries, the deliberate over-medicators, they bear some responsibilities also for yet more fatalities and sicknesses that should be avoided. Let me say that the plight of labor in this country has got to become a front burner issue in this campaign. It's not good for this country when the percent of unionized workers in the private economy drops below 10%. That's the lowest in 60 years. It's by far the lowest in the Western world. Explains a lot about why so many workers cannot earn enough money to support their families. What we must achieve, of course, is a stronger democracy to turn all these deplorable conditions around, because we know from our own inner strength and knowledge as a nation, and from the experiences of our courageous forebears who surmounted these injustices, we know that we can make them proud, make their memory proud, and we must. Just as with the past resistance to social justice movements, the dominant business lobbies are always saying no to more advanced consumer protection, environmental health, law enforcement. They're always saying no to an end to corporate welfare on the backs of middle-class taxpayers. They're always saying no to workers' rights to decent living conditions and safer workplaces, even though these executives are making more money for themselves than ever before, beyond the dreams of their avarice. They're always saying no. And you know, without going into any more detail, I think it's very telling that on more than a few occasions, when you read the New York Times and Washington Post and Newsweek, Time Magazine, Business Week, even Barron's Financial Weekly, you see investigative articles that proud reporters worked on for months at a time, documenting corporate criminal activity, corporate looting of shareholders and violating of pollution laws and damaging their worker interests and in so many other ways. And then the next week, the next month, very little happens. So I want to say that to those of you who are watching this on national television, that all you have to do is read the mainstream press to see how many injustices are documented without our political system, without our civic infrastructure being able to do anything about them. You don't have to read, although you can. There's many stalwart, smaller publications such as The Nation, Washington Monthly, Harper's, Atlantic Monthly, the Progressive Magazine, and the Progressive Populist, to name a few, to have all the evidence you want, all the heart-wrenching reports you can read, all the manifest injustices that we as Americans have to do something about. All of this disclosure without follow-up signifies the gradual closing down of civil society, symbolizing an underdeveloped democracy and an overdeveloped plutocracy or corporate state. In short, business acquisition of government to serve its insatiable short-term interests and engage in systematic non-enforcement of laws that apply to corporate abuses. I want to give you some indication of what this campaign has been about in the last 4 months or so, because it's very indicative of what our work is in the next 4 months. But you know, a lot of foreign people foreign countries, many of them our allies, think we're very insular in this country, and that we really focus just very heavily on our own problems. So permit me just a few minutes to talk about what the giant corporations are not doing or doing in terms of global impact. Of course, we remember Seattle, we remember the coalition there, we remember the criticism of the World Trade Organization. That undermines our legitimate local, state, and national sovereignties, which enable America to lead the way in worker, consumer, and environmental standards. Those are now under jeopardy because the autocratic system of government puts trade over everything else in the World Trade Organization, reversing the progress we've made in the past century, where we subordinated commerce to abolition of child labor, to environmental advances, to consumer and worker health and safety and standards of living. But now, let's face it, global corporations are on top of the world. They command the capital, technology, labor, and many governments. How have they used this unprecedented supremacy to alleviate the world's problems? And you can just make your own list of, say, the top 10 worst injustices or problems in the world. And ask yourself, have these global corporations alleviated these problems? Have they been indifferent to these problems? Have they actively obstructed the resolution of these injustices? Or have they actually contributed to alleviating these injustices? Take those four. Just a few examples. The big drug companies avoid research into global infectious diseases. There's no money in it. And it doesn't matter, there are millions of people around the world dying from malaria, tuberculosis, hemorrhagic diseases, all kinds of drugs that could be developed and vaccines until we get to the source of these epidemics in a more fundamental way. They can't be interested. Even when we tell them that drug-resistant tuberculosis is heading toward our shores, and there is now drug-resistant malaria in Thailand and other areas. Well, despite adverse publicity over their duplicitous behavior, the tobacco companies are at it again, trying to hook every possible youngster in the third world with reports of massive cancer and other tobacco-related diseases on the way. The weapons manufacturers, they're busy expanding their lethal export trade using your tax dollars in the form of subsidies. The food processing giants and the fast food chains, they're moving overseas too, displacing indigenous foods with fat and sugar pumps a la McDonald's, at the same time that the biotechnology companies are driving to change the nature of nature without answering the hard scientific questions and the questions of need that they must answer as their governing discipline. The banking giants, the banking giants and their IMF and World Bank cohorts, and there are sensitive people in those two institutions who know what the score is, but there are voices in the wilderness. These giants are continuing their structural adjustment policies in the third world countries that cut public budgets that often go for health care, that end critical consumer subsidies for food and medicine, and replace food acreage with cash crops in order to earn export dollars in hard currency in order to pay the debt of foreign Western financiers, while at the same time imposing environmentally damaging mega projects that enrich the local oligarchy. The timber companies working directly or through local firms are rapidly destroying the rich biological diversity of equatorial forests. The large energy companies want these countries to buy more nuclear and coal burning plants, not solar energy technology. They want to develop in those countries the same fossil fuel alliances and nuclear alliances with local government forces that have occurred in this country to undermine renewable energy initiatives and energy efficiency initiatives. By cutting such deals and supporting dictatorial regimes and domestic oligarchies, democratic developments that would help the people, for example, by way of land reform, agrarian credit, microcredit, cooperatives, trade union rights, and political reforms in these unfortunate countries in the third world are stymied and destroyed. And we cannot ever turn our back on the peoples of the world under that kind of oppression, especially when so many of our corporate institutions are involved in facilitating or advancing that exploitation. There is discernible conflicts between corporate purposes abroad and our national interests and traditions. When we overspend on munitions, the arms companies make money. When we wage peace through preventive diplomacy and defense to stabilize a world for people's tranquility and prosperity, these munitions companies won't make as much money. One would think that with the demise of the Soviet Union 10 years ago, we have learned some lessons from a great opportunity in history to do it differently so that all people's lives are improved. 50 years after World War II, tens of thousands of our troops are still in Europe and East Asia defending prosperous country allies who are quite able to defend themselves against non-existent enemies. Yet useless, massive weapon systems remain in the pipeline, on the drawing boards, to the chagrin of some low-level Pentagon analysts who don't see any use for them but can't speak out. And the billions and billions of dollars that are being spent further mortgage our fiscal future and drain money and talent from long overdue civilian projects here at home. At home, yes, our criminal justice system increasingly being driven by the corporate prison industry that wants more and more customers. Grossly discriminates against minorities and is greatly distorted by the extremely expensive and failed war on drugs. Given the tens of billions of dollars of taxpayer money that have been spent on the failed war on drugs year after year, we're entitled to ask the perpetrators, what is your standard of failure? What standard of failure would you ever recommend so we go back to the table and deal with this horrendous problem as a health and rehabilitation problem first? And as a community policing problem, to establish the safety of communities so people can sit on their front porches without being ricocheted by gang wars. And thirdly, and most important, is when are we going to recognize, in so many ways, that youngsters who have no purpose, who are abandoned by too many adults, who are given no useful pursuits, are going to often damage their own health in this way. And we know what the sources are because most youngsters don't damage their health in this way. So why don't we look at our youngsters as worthy of more and more of our time. With more people in our prisons than communist China, our prisons have become very often finishing schools for criminal recidivism. At the same time, the criminal justice system excludes criminally behaving corporations and their well-defended executives from Article 7. You know, a more insidious influence of the way corporations make us feel powerless came home to me many years ago when I took on the auto industry. And the auto industry did this very cleverly. It didn't give us any frame of alternative vehicle reference. It just said, here they are, gas guzzlers, fins, hood ornaments, all kinds of interior decor, 400 horsepower. As one ad says, when you buy one of these cars, you'll have your own personal nuclear deterrent. Those are the exact words. Now, so we all grew up corporate thinking there was no other way to drive around other than the cars they gave us, which were cars subordinated by stylistic pornography, and their own engineers were not allowed to do their work. You know, most of the new safety features that have come on cars in the last 30 years were developed before World War I. Seat belts, padded dash panels, that goes back to the Roman chariots. Collapsible steering columns, you know, that was patented in 1912 or so. Stronger door latches, no big deal. The airbag was developed in the early 1950s. That's the degree to which the talent in this country, scientific engineering, is suppressed by these pinhead corporate executives up there at the top. When we stopped growing up corporate regarding automobile safety, fuel efficiency, and emission controls in the late 60s and early 70s, what do you think happened? When the civic forces moved in, look what happened. Let me tell you, motor vehicles have a long way to go. But compared to the 60s, look what happened. The death rate on the motor vehicle highways in 1966 was 5.6 fatalities for every 100 million vehicle miles traveled. And last year, it was down to 1.6 fatalities per 100 million vehicle miles traveled. That's millions. Those are millions of American casualties prevented, deaths, injuries, family anguish, lost hopes prevented. And it spilled over to other countries as well. There's much less carbon monoxide. You think those members of Congress did the right thing then because one solitary young lawyer went up there? No, it's when you found out about it. You found out how you were being ripped off, shortchanged, how your friends and some members of your family, your children, were killed in totally needless ways because cars were not crash-worthy to protect people. That's when the politicians who had their finger to the wind felt the wind, and we got to give them more wind. Just in case some people are wondering about the dominant role that we're giving corporate power in this country, let me refer them to an article written in a book published in 1959 by William Gossett, then Vice President of Ford Motor Company and later President of the American Bar Association, when he called the modern corporation the dominant institution in our society. The dominant institution. Now, you cannot have that be the dominant institution in our society. The dominant institution of our society should be democratic institutions run by a deliberative democracy of, by, and for the people. Those are the Remember, we create these corporations through corporate charters. Our state governments create them. Without corporate charters created by the state governments, none of these corporations would exist. And back in 100 years ago or so, 150, 200 years ago, our forebears looked at the charter not just as the creator of these corporations, but an accountability mechanism. Sometimes they pulled the charter. Sometimes they put the companies on probation. Sometimes they gave these charters 10 years duration, renewable on good behavior. So let's recover our lost knowledge. Let's recover our history. And let's say that if corporate charters could be conditioned on good behavior when they're much smaller and with less potential harm because of more modest technology in the 19th century, clearly we now have to have a national debate on corporations as persons under our law or whether they should be artificial entities under our law. Corporations. And let me say that corporations as artificial entities can never, in a vibrant democracy, be allowed to have equal constitutional power with real people. Just as our law does to crooked labor unions that are placed in trusteeships and the leadership removed to rehabilitate the labor union, why doesn't our law also establish a trusteeship for criminal or misbehaving or harmful corporations and remove their leadership and rehabilitate them as well? Now, there is a rather poignant area of corporate abuse that I never thought I would ever see or describe. There used to be a time in our country when businesses would never sell directly to little children, other than maybe bubble gum. They never bypassed the parents. They never thought to sell directly and undermine the authority of parents. That's all gone now. Massive merchandising strategies, beam on 2, 3, 4, 5-year-olds, 6, 7, 8-year-olds. And you know it, parents know it, it's going into our schools, it's going into homes, and with more and more parents commuting longer, being absent from the home, the children are being delivered to these corporate hucksters. Not just television, not just video, not just internet, all kinds of often harmful products. And the messages are basically threefold by too many of these corporate miscreants. And that is, one, violence is a solution to life's problems. Just look at the devastating, gruesome, sadistic cartoons, for example. And second, low-grade sensuality from junk food to pornography is conveyed to them. And third, addiction as a way of life. Trying to turn these young children into gazers, into spectators. The average is now 30 hours a week for preteen youngsters. And is it any wonder that they're registering, these youngsters are registering as being more obese and more out of shape than any youngster since records were kept in 1900? Is it any surprise that their attention spans have been shrunken so that their vocabularies often are down to 30 or 40 words? Is it any wonder that they don't have the pace to listen to a paragraph in school or to go to school without seeming incredibly agitated? Is it any wonder that these children are spending less time with their siblings and their children, neighbors, and their parents? Children today spend less time with adults than any generation in history. And there's a penalty to be paid for that. Now, the corporations are not all responsible for that. The way our economy is designed, the way we have to spend so much time going from school to work and from home to work. But I must say, these corporations are taking exquisite and technological advantage of these children. They can even be compared to electronic child molesters. And we have a responsibility We have the responsibilities. We connect civic movements with political movements. We have a responsibility to prepare the next generation to become literate, self-renewing, effective citizens for a deliberative democracy. Instead, this commercial traffic makes them even more vulnerable to the streets. So offensive are these intrusions to the basic norms of nurturing a wholesome childhood that people, conservatives and liberals alike, are joining together to protest, demand restraints, and encourage a wider association of adults, including retired adults, with children. There are good reasons why every major religion in the world has warned against giving excessive power to the commercial interest, to the profiteering interest, because it is so singularly focused on its goal, which has no boundaries, that it runs roughshod over major value systems that spell a civilized society. The question is, how badly do we want a just and decent society? A society that raises our expectation levels about ourselves and our community. How badly do we really want it? This is the question. It's one thing to know. It's one thing to know. Yes, well, I will give you a chance in a few minutes to prove your point. First, a quick tour around America in the last 3 months to give you an idea of what I mean when I say that the best political campaigns are the ones who search out civic groups that pursue injustice. In Toledo, Ohio, we joined with members of a community of some 80 householders and 16 small businesses whose property was taken by the city under threat of eminent domain to provide Daimler Chrysler with a landscaping area. Already the cowed city had given Chrysler ample acreage for its expanded Jeep plant. The city of Toledo agreed to clear the land free for the giant company, absorb any environmental liabilities. It gave Daimler Chrysler a tax holiday of about 10 years as part of a nearly $300 million package of federal, state, and local subsidies. The auto company got the additional land it wanted for its shrubbery. And a long-time cohesive neighborhood was utterly demolished, just like Detroit's Pole Town was in the 1980s. And out of that rubble of a community came a World War II veteran when we visited. And he said, with eloquent simplicity, "I fought the fascists in World War II, and I come back to my country, and near my retirement, I see that my home taken away from me and demolished. Never thought that this would ever happen in America." Well, let me tell you, we have filed a constitutional lawsuit against the city of Toledo and Daimler Chrysler to make sure it doesn't happen. By the way, Daimler Chrysler had $20 billion in cash in the bank at that time. In Madison, Wisconsin, we marched with workers picketing for a livable wage. They were working for an independent contractor who provided services for the University of Wisconsin. In Atlanta, we stood in solidarity with a large homeless shelter in the downtown business district, where homeless people are not supposed to be seen. The city, accordingly, has not given the shelter a kitchen permit for 2 years. In Nashville, Tennessee, I met Tom Burrell, now running for the U.S. Senate on the Green Party. Mr. Burrell returned from Vietnam years ago to work in the auto industry in Michigan. After a number of years, he came home to Tennessee to farm a large tract of land. There he learned about the shocking state of black farmers in America, a mere shred of a percentage of the number of black farmers that once worked the land in the 1920s. These farmers were dispossessed of most of their land and forced to give up their farms, in no small part to the blatantly discriminatory behavior by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which is now offering to make inadequate amends. Mr. Burrell has been a transforming leader of these farmers seeking recompense and land. I noted to him that 30 years ago, one of our reports contained an early expose of this very problem. And he is now leading demonstrations in front of the U.S. Department of Agriculture frequently. In Boston, right next to Fenway Park, we gathered with members of the neighborhood at a news conference. The issue was a forthcoming demand by the Boston tax sox, shall we call them, that some $300 million in tax monies be used to help build a new ballpark with nice skyboxes nearby. The neighborhood groups, disturbed by the diversion of tax dollars from neglected needs of the city and its people, wondered why renovation of this historic park was not wiser than demolition. Did not the Red Sox learn from the experience of the New England Patriots? You know where I'm coming from, huh? That football team who traveled to Hartford on an ocean of corporate welfare subsidies, $500 million, compliments of the Republican governor and the Democratic-controlled legislature, with virtually no hearings. And everybody thought it was a done deal, that the New England Patriots were going to have a stadium with skyboxes, if they're empty, guaranteed by Connecticut's taxpayers. Pretty good deal. But you know what happened? Spearheaded by the Green Party, which led a coalition that I was involved in, that brought together Greenwich, Connecticut stockbrokers and blue-collar workers in Willimantic and anti-tax waste conservatives, environmentalists and consumerists, that aroused a, shall we say, subdued press on this issue. And within 4 months, that agreement was taken apart, and the head of the Patriots came to Hartford to announce that he was rushing back to Boston to build a stadium with his own money for a change. A hand for the Connecticut Green Party. I might add, all the odds were stacked against that Green Party. The polls were 3-1 because they didn't have the information in favor of the stadium. All the politicians, all the media, and in 4 months, the Green Party won for the taxpayers of Connecticut. And a lesson that tax dollars should be used for serious purposes affecting human beings, not for corporate entertainment. Someone told me, you know, this is just like ancient Rome, the Roman Colosseum, you know. I said, no, there's one difference. At least they let the fans in free. In Montana and Idaho, we heard unassailable arguments that stopping the logging on national forests made superior environmental, economic, and job sense. Enjoy these forests now and for future generations rather than destroy them for a mere 3% of the nation's annual timber harvest and $1.2 billion of annual taxpayer subsidies to the timber barons, as our great environmentalist David Brower told us at his home in California. He said, quote, "Let the forests breathe for us," unquote. And we should at this point, we should pay tribute to Barry Commoner, who led the Citizens Party in 1980 and plowed the ground. Another great environmentalist. In Hartford, Connecticut's grim inner city, amidst the fancy office buildings of the affluent insurance industry, we met with clergy from the churches and social activists and discussed what this so-called booming economy has left behind in misery, deprivation, and the resistance by neighborhood heroes. In Nebraska and Iowa, we learned about the shocking crisis of much rural farm country, where small ranchers and farmers, despite working from dawn to dusk, cannot make a living. They are being mercilessly squeezed by big buyers and big sellers who are relentlessly driving toward an industrialized corporate contract agriculture mutated by genetic engineering. In Hawaii, that was an interesting one in Hawaii. We visited one of the early legal plots in the United States to grow industrial hemp. And it was a bizarre medieval experience. Here's this 5,000-year-old plant with 50,000 uses, from textiles to paper to fiber to fuel, you name it, medicines, lubricants, cosmetics. Here is this 5,000-year-old plant, was being planted in a fraction of an acre, surrounded by a barbed wire fence, with saturation giant night lights. I didn't see any bloodhounds around. And this little plant was surrounded by another giant fence, and it was staffed by one biologist who had a wry way about himself. He mentioned that a couple nights ago some birds flew over the fence and satisfied themselves with some hemp seeds. He had to file that report with the government, of course. We've had a petition before the DEA to get industrial hemp off the prescribed list, and it's about time the farmers and the environmentalists and this country's interest in energy independence be respected by allowing the growth of industrial hemp. In West Virginia, the misbehavior of King Coal is painfully visible. Some coal companies think nothing of blowing off the tops of mountains with the rubble damming the streams for tens of miles downstream and undermining these impoverished communities. There hasn't been much objection from the Clinton-Gore administration about this at all. Unfortunately, this is the kind of message the people of Appalachia have learned to endure. A message of indifference, which has only been changed by civic action to give the workers in the coal mines compensation for black lung disease starting back in the late 60s, and a modicum of safety standards and health standards to curtail coal dust. That started with the citizen movement, and then the government reacted. From Minnesota, my vice presidential running mate, Winona LaDuke. And I called a conference of tribal leaders about the need for our government to respect their treaties, end the budgetary and other discrimination in the health and education areas against some of the poorest areas in our country. And this is long overdue. Around the country, from Delaware to Kentucky to Oregon to Minnesota, we joined with students deeply involved with the anti-sweatshop movement. And with workers. And with workers who have lost their jobs to these sweatshops abroad. We surveyed and confirmed the need for modern public transit, really modern public transit, and the wonderful new technologies that community groups were demanding to enable low-income people and disabled people to get to work and to relieve the enormous time wasted in choking bumper-to-bumper traffic. We spoke from nurses from coast to coast about furthering their leading role with other patient rights groups and advancing the well-being of patients, the quality of health care, and first and foremost, now, universal health care for everyone in this country. And by the way, a tip of the hat to the California Nurses Association. The union that sets standards for unions everywhere. And we're so proud to receive the first union endorsement from the California Nurses Association. Just last year, they got 5 bills through Sacramento helping the health and safety of patient rights. I mean, there's a union who knows where its priorities are. How uplifting were our conversations with peace and nuclear arms reduction groups all over the country, whose members, you've seen many of them, they come across this way. They look sagacious, experienced, and have had years behind them. Determined, sagacious, and experienced veterans of waging peace. Men and women whose concern is first and foremost for the 7 generations ahead. They set a new standard for grandparenting. A new standard. We should recall in a parochial note that the nuclear freeze movement began in New England, in town meetings in New England. It began with citizen groups. Around the country, we saw struggling small businesses, the Main Street core of their community, slipping behind the onslaught of the Walmarts and other giant chains that have privileges not available to your local corner merchant. We met with volunteers and donors at receptions filled with civic activists, excited over the premises and promises of an expanded Green Party. You know, how do you get a majority party in this country? Here's a simple formula. It takes about 1 million Americans pledging 100 volunteer hours a year, raising $100 a year, going forward with a deep, profound agenda that's congenial to millions of Americans, and we will establish a majority political party before you know it. Now comes the essence of what we're all about. I hope you have enough voice left. You'll know that I've said a progressive political party is most authentic when it connects with or arises from citizen movements and does not forget where it's coming from or its reason for being. Major changes for the betterment of human beings start with major changes of direction. Such changes start with small steps taken by each individual and their community together with other individuals. And these small steps evolve into ever larger steps, which are thereby more tested and sure-footed. I have here the Constitution of the United States, the preamble. And you'll remember the Pledge of Allegiance. The Pledge of Allegiance in this country ends with the phrase, with liberty and justice for all. Not with liberty and justice for a few, not with liberty and justice for corporations, not with liberty and justice for some. They said it just the way we have to pledge it, with liberty and justice for all. The Constitution's preamble, right here, those of you who want to reread it, it starts out this way. Think of the timeliness of the language, if you will. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. That's the quote. Now remember, they didn't say we the corporations, did they? They said we the people. And so, let's start the countdown. And let's get your response. And get it in a way where you really mean it. And millions of Americans whom you will reach, millions of Americans who are watching this Green Party convention will respond to, because it resonates with their deepest impulses for a better life for all. Who will achieve the independence of our elections from the predatory torrent of corporate and other special interest cash by financing public elections with public money. This will remove roadblocks to endless injustices that our country should be ready to prevent and diminish. This is an issue that cuts across almost all our other causes, whether it's universal health care, policies for our children, and other varieties of freedom that involve the fulfillment of human possibilities. Who will repeal the restrictive labor laws such as Taft-Hartley, which fuel the obstruction of trade union organizing for tens of millions of American workers who do not earn a livable wage and who are part of a declining level of desperate humanity in this country? Who will provide adequate budgets and the willpower for enforcing and strengthening the environmental, consumer health safety protections and job safety laws against corporate crime, fraud, abuse, and negligence that is so often reported in the mainstream media, but alas, to little effect? Who? Who will end hundreds of billions of dollars of corporate welfare, the so familiar subsidies, giveaways, and bailouts, so that these monies can be meet the real needs of the American people? We will! Who will discover and publicize the small and medium-sized businesses as those in the social venture network and other places that believe and are acting on sustainable economic principles like the Interface Corporation in Atlanta, Georgia? We will! These are the businesses that put the lie to big business, who are constantly saying they don't know how to produce the technology for a sustainable economy. Who will allow our rich country to become a society at long last, after decades of broken promises, to end once and for all the curse of poverty? We will! Who will, at long last, seriously initiate the transformations of our energy economy to renewable solar energy and energy efficiency? Some of these solar energy techniques have been around for centuries. Who will advance the appropriate technologies that redefine efficiency and productivity as if consumers, environment, workers, and all other human beings mattered? Who will elevate the many civil servants in our own federal government above the demeaning stereotypes that politicians have pasted on them, and liberate their own knowledge, their own insights, and their own imagination to make our government a wondrous servant of our highest promises? Who will assure these civil servants, they include physicians in the Food and Drug Administration, engineers, scientists, lawyers, cost analysts, procurement managers, and others, who will assure them that they will have a place to work where they can bring their conscience to work and their ethics to work every day? Who will establish our own media, our own television, radio, and cable networks as a functioning and deliberative democracy desires, needs? Who? Who will reserve part of our public airwaves, which the people own in the first place, for programming that reflects our solutions, our cultures, our sense of the heroic, and the many models of little-known success that need to be publicized and emulated and applied? Who can lift the horizons of the pursuit of happiness in our society through the pursuit of justice, so that bigotry, discrimination, and virulent intolerance recede toward oblivion? Who will expand the definition of national security and national purpose to show how, with reasonable amounts of knowledge, resources, and goodwill, we can rapidly begin to defeat the global scourges of poverty, contagious disease, illiteracy, lack of shelter, environmental devastation, and also to recognize and liberate the genius of third world peoples to help their potential to flower? One only can refer to people like Paulo Freire, the great Brazilian educator, who taught illiterate peasants how to read in a few weeks with no fancy materials. We can only recall the great people's architect Hassan Fathi of Egypt, who taught the impoverished peasants of Egypt how to build homes, some of them elegantly simple and beautiful from the soil under their feet. The homelessness problem is massive in the third world. We can only recall the great success of the Grameen Bank and the microcredit that gave tens of thousands of women and others a chance through small loans to start their own businesses. Let's focus not just on our own genius. Let's focus on the enormous genius of third world peoples which have been suppressed. Isn't it time? Isn't it about time that the government stops supporting dictators and oligarchies with our tax monies, with our munitions, with our perverted diplomacy? Isn't it time that our government takes a cue from numerous studies and civic models from here overseas and advances foreign policies that support the peasants and the workers for a change? Do we want to say to the 70 million Americans who do not vote for many good reasons sometimes? They think their vote doesn't count. They think that they don't want to legitimize the process. Do we want to say to those 70 million non-voters that the Greens want you, they want you to help them build a new beginning, because the Greens will give you no excuses for any further abdication of your civic duty to join us and help build a great society? We go around exhorting our petitioners to get us on the ballot over these huge hurdles constructed by the Republican and Democratic parties to exclude competition. They have to ask whether the person in the mall or down the street or at the health food store or in front of a church is a registered voter. Because if they're not a registered voter, the signature is not verified. Well, I think we have to talk to non-voters, to seek out non-voters. Maybe some of you can discern them after a while. To seek out non-voters and to register them and to expand the efforts all over college campuses and union halls and church basements to register to vote. Now, if you'll indulge me for just a few more minutes, I have a message for some special constituents. To the contented classes of America, which I will define as the top 5% in income in our country. The contented classes. I ask, is your choice only to exit from the scene of problems, or is it also to add your voice? If you don't like the quality of drinking water in your community, you've got the means to buy bottled water. If you don't like the situation in the public schools in your city, you can just haul off and move to a more pleasant community. If you don't like a lot of things, this country gives you the opportunity to exit what you don't like. That's being a quitter. Because you among the contented classes are the people of influence, of contacts, who get their calls returned. You are the citizens who can give voice to the powerless and the beleaguered to improve their conditions. It isn't that they don't have voice. You go into the worst and poorest areas in our country. There's plenty of voice. It's just that nobody's hearing it. Nobody's listening to it. And the contented classes can amplify those voices. And I'll give you an example. My classmates at Princeton University, Princeton class of 1955, and Harvard Law School, class of 58, have chosen to voice, not just to exit. Over 10 years ago, our Princeton class established a Center for Civic Leadership to place undergraduates in dozens of civic organizations dedicated strictly to systematic change. The belief is that a society that has more justice is a society that needs less charity. This Alumni Center is also pursuing a major effort to reorder our public health budget and priorities so a major assault be conducted on global tuberculosis. In 1993, members of my law school class of 1958, and let me tell you that this class has more than its share of corporate lawyers. It established the Appleseed Foundation that organizes state-based centers for law and justice. Over a dozen of these centers are underway in a dozen states, and more are underway. And their purpose is to further systemic approaches to systemic injustices. How many other alumni classes of some 30 years out or more around the country's universities and colleges, who also produce the contented classes, can develop their own systemic initiatives for building democracy and justice? Well, I'll tell you, you'll never hear support for these kinds of efforts as a routine part of a political campaign by the Republican and Democratic parties. But you'll hear it from the Green Party candidate week after week. Because a progressive political movement highlights civic energies which are dedicated to the proposition that a society which has more justice is a society that can realistically pursue happiness. And one might say the pursuit of happiness involves a lot of the pursuit of justice as well. Too many good people in this country are walking around with invisible chains, if not golden handcuffs, which restrict their contributions to the good life for themselves and their fellow citizens. A progressive political movement liberates their wisdom, judgment, experience, creativity, and idealism. By the way, all those traits are not tested by standardized educational tests. To millions of retired Americans with such capacities, a progressive political movement will offer endless opportunities for community-based patriotism to blossom. We need you, after you retire, to start a new stage in your life, to start a fresh contribution to a fresh, progressive political campaign. There is no reason why our society has to be organized in such a way as to make older people feel that they're out of sight and they're out of mind and they're not wanted anymore and they're not needed anymore. Well, the Progressive Green Party movement wants you, needs you, and will be with you. By the way, by now you know I'm not using a teleprompter. I love these politicians. They go like this, you know. Hoping that the guy who controls it keeps it moving, huh? Otherwise they'll lose half a page. Now to the youth of America, I say beware of being trivialized by the commercial corporate culture that tempts you daily, tempts you hourly. I hear you saying often that you're not turned on to politics. Well, let me bring to bear the lessons of history. If you're not turned on to politics, the lesson of history is that politics will turn on you. The fact that we have so many inequities and inequalities, the fact that there's so much corporate regulation over our lives. I mean, just look, how many times every day do the corporations regulate you compared to government? The corporations also regulate government to regulate you. But apart from that, you go to an HMO and they tell you no, yes, no CAT scan, yes, tying the hands of the doctors and the nurses. You go to an auto insurance company, it doesn't even seem to want to pay very often, and they touch on this fine print, you know, which is the exclusions or deductions. And you go into one area or another, your credit, your genes, your privacy, increasingly, your voice as a citizen is being regulated in so many complex and insidious ways by too much power in the hands of too few corporations. Well, democracy doesn't respond well to cynicism. It doesn't respond well to having citizens drop out on it. It responds to hands-on participation and to energized imagination. Because that's its essence. We need the young people of America to move into leadership positions, to shape their future, their own future, as part of this campaign for a just society. We're going to ask the young people of America, who among you are going to be the leaders in saving the equatorial forests? Who among you are going to be the leaders in preserving our oceans? Who among you are going to be the leaders in abolishing poverty, in nurturing childhood, in injecting matters of the spirit and well-being?
The sovereignty of the people over the sovereignty of corporations, leading to a strong democracy. So it's because if you're not turned on to politics, politics is going to turn on you. Well, you'll be more likely to run a poll, particularly at a younger age, if you know what the issues are and if you can push for real choices and who's the candidate. Democracy means the word self-government. Well, if you want to live in a free country, you also have to be an active citizen. You've got to try to improve the country.
These corporations are meddling with the most priceless genetic inheritance
Thank you very much. None of this would have been possible without people in this room and all over the country. The stimulation to the campaign by various candidates in the primary season here. And I want to really express my appreciation for a lot of unsung categories of citizen action. Organizers, canvassers, petitioners, our great staff in Washington, and the one that's building up around the country, who are working enormous hours with incredible dedication. So much so that I have to tell them to go home at the end of the day. On behalf of all Americans who seek a new direction, who yearn for a new birth of freedom to build the just society, who see justice as the great work of human beings on earth, who understand that community and human fulfillment are mutually self-enforcing, who respect the urgent necessity to wage peace, to protect the environment, to end poverty, and to preserve values of the spirit for future generations, who wish to build a deep democracy by working hard for a regenerative, progressive politics. To all these citizens...
Nader is a patriot and a civic hero. He embodies the highest office in a democracy, the office of citizen. By common consent, he is public citizen number one. Now he is running all out with pumping hard, full tilt for the presidency. He's on the ballot in 30 states, 31 as of today, and going to 48. He's raised $1 million and going for 10, counting the matching funds. He's already campaigned in 4 months in all 50 states. He has plunged altogether into the passion and action of these times, and we are honored to be able to be witness and participant in this great adventure. This all began when a young Princeton and Harvard Law graduate was working on the unsafety of cars, and General Motors hired spies to follow him. What GM learned was don't mess with Ralph Nader. The public rage against GM gave Nader a great moral and political power that he has used wisely, carefully, and well, and that has led us to this day. He has written books, testified before Congress, fostered the practice of public interest law, and inspired and shepherded citizen activists. He has been a one-man social movement, a single-point source of some of the best things that have happened in our country for the past 35 years. Like an oak tree dropping an acorn, he founded Public Citizen. He founded the Center for Auto Safety. He founded the Disability Rights Center, the Pension Rights Center, Congress Watch, Public Campaign, the Student Public Interest Research Groups in more than 20 states, and state and local models for lawyers to fight City Hall and those damn developers. Yet, also, he alone, Mr. Nader, he himself, formed citizens groups to fight for safe air travel, for clean water, for healthy food, for an open government. He encouraged the formation of consumer co-ops like Buyers Up to keep the price of home heating oil low in the Northeast. He and his Naders Raiders are responsible, as Jim Hightower was saying, for the Safe Water Act, the Safe Air Act, the Freedom of Information Act, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, the Occupational Safety and Health Agency, and the Environmental Protection Agency. Corporate abuse worldwide is documented in his excellent multinational monitor. And when corporate power and abuse went global, so did he. Nader groups like Global Trade Watch and Public Citizen led the fight in Seattle against the WTO. which was the fight for safe workplaces, safe food, a clean environment, and a living wage for the people in countries all over the world beyond this one. Now, since GM sent its spies to watch Mr. Nader, the safety measures that the government has ordered the automakers to build in have saved, out of the deaths in car crashes that would have occurred on the projections otherwise, about 1 million of our lives. Not to mention our limbs. God, we're in his debt. He and his teams have improved the quality of the food we eat, the water we drink, the air we breathe. Our airplanes, our jobs, our children are safer because of him. The information about the government and the big corporations that is in our minds is truer because of him. Now, we can repay a smidgen of the debt today when he speaks by not flashing cameras at him. He asks that that not happen, and he will stay at the podium after he has finished speaking for that purpose as freely as you want. Mr. Nader has disclosed to the press that he has $4 million. Power to him. He lives on $25,000 a year and doesn't even have a car. With $500,000 of his dollars, he funded studies of the voting records of members of Congress, which certainly weren't worth $500,000. Don't, the billionaires don't, the Chinese don't. The people of the United States own our elections, and we are going to give the country and the world the shock of this period by electing Ralph Nader President of the United States. With 118 candidates running across the country for everything from town council to the U.S. Senate, and with Mr. Nader leading us, this will be the year of the Greens. But we do not crusade for ourselves alone. We crusade for our country, but not for our country alone either. The human race and all of the earth are jeopardized by oil and coal and smog and ozone holes, and we all know it. We crusade for 6 billion people and all our posterity down to the 70th generation. For when Mr. Nader leads America, America will worthily lead the world. And so, after a brief 5-minute video, which will follow what I have to say, with pride and honor, I present to this Green Party convention of the Association of State Green Parties, and we present to the people of the United States our nominee for President of the United States, Ralph Nader.
Never get discouraged. Never get discouraged.
What do you suppose I called to give us this good advice? Ralph Nader!
When you sit down behind the wheel of a car and look around you, what do you see that you don't like?
Well, fundamentally, I see a room full of knives and sharp edges.
Well, I think a lot of the critics don't know what they're talking about.
I always look on lawyers as people who should be representing justice and defending the disadvantaged and the power.
They have to recall 250,000 square feet of artificial turf because they said there's too much lead in the green paint. Yeah, damn Ralph Nader.
General Motors for the DuPont.
Two parties are more than
No difference between Gore and Bush except their rhetoric. The same politicians who gave us massive deficits, scandals, and SNL bailouts turned around and gave themselves a $35,000 a year salary increase. Please call me around. We're up here. Anything you want. Do you enjoy eating macaroni? New York, it's Saturday night. Student groups, consumer groups, environmental groups, all on the same side. It's because everything they believe in is being removed further and further to the Geneva headquarters of the WTO. And the World Bank is to impose deprivation and disaster on third world people.
Giving the results of their state convention yesterday, they were sorry they could not attend this, but state law requires that they have their convention yesterday. But the fax contains the information that they vote unanimously for Ralph Nader.
Did you keep a pen? And here comes the tally of votes.
Okay, well, thanks to the miracle of modern computers, we have the totals now. They are 295 votes in favor of Ralph Nader and Winona LaDuke, 10 votes in favor of Stephen Gaskin and Winona LaDuke, 10 votes in favor of Jello Biafra and Mumia Abu Jamal, and 1 vote for none of the above. Okay. Clearly, after the first round of voting, we have a majority in favor of Ralph Nader and Winona LaDuke. And we'd like to ask now to see the unanimous consent of this body that we are supporting Ralph Nader, Winona LaDuke to be the next President of the United States. Okay, calm down.
Go we go! 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 Delegates, representatives of the Green Parties of America, one last time I want to bring Jello Biafra and Stephen Gaskin up for your enthusiastic appreciation. They have both pledged to work enthusiastically for the ticket, with or without the promise of a federal judgeship. And now I'd like to introduce the man who will bring Ralph Nader to the podium. Ronnie Duggar. Ronnie Duggar is a reporter, a biographer of Lyndon Johnson and Ronald Reagan, a founder and editor of the Texas Observer, as well as the Alliance for Democracy. And, not to be outdone by anyone in this room, Ronnie Duggar is seeking the Green Party of New York State nomination for the United States Senate.
Mr. Nader is a singularity. He is Mr. Emerson's great person, the one who in the midst of the crowd keeps with perfect sweetness the independence of solitude. He is an astonishment of informedness, fresh opinions, high good humor, and always his service to his relentless, lifelong resolve to do the good thing for democracy and the people. He's a great reader, and he gives friends books like some people give advice. He is always an inspiration. He said to a young woman who was joining one of his projects, "Give all you've got down to the marrow of your bones." That's what he gives all the time. Many of us scattered over the country, and I imagine most of us in this room, aspire to be like him. To be the person who knows of himself, as Mr. Emerson also knew of himself, that what I must do is all that concerns me, not what people think. Unquestionably, Mr. $1 million, he gives 80% of his money to civic projects, which, as someone said on the internet, is 70% more than that which is required by the Bible. What has been Mr. Nader's underlying motive in all this passionate work? Gandhi said that we must be brave enough to love one another. Nader told us yesterday afternoon, here at the Green Party convention, at the reception, that when he was little, his mother, who is here with him, asked him, "Are you a patriot?" "Yes," he said. "Do you love your country?" "Yes," he said. "Well," she said, "I hope you make it more lovable. That is the essence of patriotism, making your country more lovable." By backing Mr. Nader, we are joining him in exercising the power of love for our country. Mr. Nader is running for president for love of his country, and we support him for president because we love our country, and we love justice, and we love the home, which is the earth where we all live. And the time has come for the citizens of the United States to rebel politically. We support Mr. Nader because we refuse to stay in the two-party trap forever, because only he is broaching and discussing the issues of the converging human crisis that we as a people must discuss and decide. Because for good citizens, casting your vote shouldn't make you sick. Because when we vote for Ralph Nader, we will be very proud of that vote. We support him also, and so should we all, simply because he is the best person running. We know that from his 40 years of public service that he is not for sale. Unlike some candidates we might name but will not, he will not sell out. Unlike, he has the integrity of Thoreau, he has the compassion of St. Francis, and he, better than those really, knows how the government works. With unofficial power, he has already achieved more governmental reform than we have had since the 1930s. We haven't had a man, in my opinion, like Ralph Nader, run for president since Thomas Jefferson and Abraham Lincoln combined. Mr. Nader was so relaxed, informal, and happy at the reception yesterday that John Anderson said to him, "Ralph, you've loosened up quite a bit." I believe that's because he has decided that he can win. Yesterday he told the press, "I want to win." Today he was asked by an important journalist if he thought he could win. He replied, "Yes." Today we say together, we will win. Ralph Nader is going to get in those debates, and he is going to win because he should get in those debates, and he should win, and because we the people are still we the people. The TV stations don't own our elections. Anheuser-Busch, the Democratic Party, and the Republican Party do not own our elections. The big corporations don't. The Indonesians